Welcome to Revenge with Sue. My channel features fictional, high-stakes family dramas and narrative stories crafted for audiences who appreciates a story where dignity wins and boundaries are finally drawn. With this story we are about to enjoy, it takes a critical look at how characters of persons are revealed during crisis. Has this happened to you before? Take a seat and enjoy the drama that unfolds. If you have not subscribed to the channel, kindly subscribe and click on the like button. They say that time is a river, but in the Sterling household, time was an anchor. The first thing Arthur Sterling ever learned wasn't how to speak or how to walk, it was how to listen. In the dim, oil-scented workshop of his childhood, the world was built of brass, steel, and the steady, relentless heartbeat of 1,000 pendulums. His father, Henry, was a ghost of a man, quiet, precise, his eyes always magnified by a jeweler's loupe. But his mother, Margaret, was the lifeblood. She taught Arthur that a clock isn't just a machine to tell you when to eat or sleep. It is a witness. It is a debt of honor you owe to every person who came before you. One morning, when the winter of 1995 remains a jagged, crystalline memory in Arthur's mind. It was the year the frost didn't just sit on the windows, it sat in their very bones. It was a cruel architect, freezing the pipes of their Cotswold cottage until they burst like glass, and freezing the Sterling bank accounts after a wealthy client, a duke from the north, declared bankruptcy, vanishing into the night with a year's worth of Henry's labor. Arthur, 10 years old, sat in the corner of the workshop. He watched his father's hands shake, the one thing a master clockmaker cannot afford. The cold was an eraser, slowly rubbing out the edges of their lives. The coal cellar was a hollow cavern of black dust, the larder held nothing but a heel of dry bread and a jar of bitter marmalade. Margaret entered the room. She carried her only inheritance, a heavy, itchy wool blanket, deep indigo, and smelling of cedar and her own mother's lavender. She didn't wrap herself, though her own breath came in ragged white plumes. She knelt before Arthur and cocooned him until he was a mound of wool. She stayed awake all night, her body a physical shield against the drafts that whistled through the floorboards. She traded her sleep and her warmth so that her son would never know what it felt like to truly freeze. By morning, her joints were so stiff she couldn't uncurl her fingers, but Arthur was warm. These are heartwarming moments of pure sacrifice of a mother for son. The time of transition of Arthur from the workshop to the university was paved not with gold, but with the skin of Margaret's palms. When Arthur received his acceptance letter to medical school, the joy was a brief spark extinguished by the reality of the tuition bill. The Sterling name carried prestige, but prestige doesn't pay for textbooks or cadaver labs. "I found work as a consultant for the London estates," Margaret lied, her voice steady and her eyes bright. "They need someone who understands the value of heirlooms. I'll be advising the elite on their collections." This was a lie, all to keep her beloved son in school so he does not feel bad. Arthur believed her. He spent his days in the sterile, silent libraries of London, burying his head in anatomy and pharmacology. He thought his mother was sitting in velvet-lined parlors, sipping Earl Grey and identifying 17th-century escapements. He found out the truth on a rainy Tuesday in October. He had returned from London early to surprise her with a bouquet of grocery store carnations. The house was silent, save for a rhythmic splashing of water coming from the kitchen. He found her there, her back to him, her hands submerged in a deep ceramic bowl filled with a mixture of milk and oil. When she pulled them out, Arthur dropped the flowers. The skin was sloughing off in red, angry strips. Her fingernails were brittle and yellowed. She hadn't been a consultant. She had been a scrubber, the lowest tier of domestic help in Mayfair. She had been on her knees for 12 hours a day, using industrial-grade lye, acidic, cheap soap, to strip centuries of grime from the marble floors of mansions. The chemicals had eaten through her cheap rubber gloves and into her flesh. She was literally scrubbing her own body away to buy the ink and paper for his degrees. "It's just a reaction, Arthur," she said, her voice cracking as she tried to hide her hands behind her back. "You're melting for me," he cried, his voice breaking. "No," she replied, her eyes flashing with that old, workshop fire. "I am turning my sweat into your future." A Sterling does not complain about the friction required to make the gears turn. "Now go back to your books. Don't let my minutes be wasted." Arthur had graduated from the university with flying colors. Shortly after graduation, he met Sienna, the love of his life. He met her not a high society gala or a gallery opening. It was in the basement of a free clinic in East London, 3 years after he had qualified as a surgeon. It was a Tuesday, the air thick with the smell of wet wool and antiseptic. Arthur was volunteering, his hands, the hands his mother had sacrificed her own skin to train, were stitching the wound of a man who had fallen in a warehouse. That was when he saw her. Sienna was sitting in the corner of the waiting room. She didn't look like a queen then. She looked like a ghost. Her coat was thin, a cheap polyester blend that offered no protection against the London sleet. She was clutching a plastic folder to her chest like it was a shield. She wasn't there for herself, she was there for her younger brother, who was shivering with a fever she couldn't afford to treat. When Arthur approached her, he didn't see a socialite. He saw his mother. He saw the same frantic, exhausted hunger in her eyes that he had seen in Margaret's during the winter of '95. He saw a woman who was being ground down by the gears of a city that didn't care if she lived or died. "I can't pay for the consultation," she had whispered, her voice brittle. "But he's all I have." Arthur, moved by a profound, misplaced pity, stayed late. He treated the boy, bought them hot soup from the vending machine, and used his own Uber account to send them home. He felt a hero's rush, a Sterling's need to fix the broken rhythm of a life. Sienna played the role of the grateful survivor to perfection. She told him stories of her childhood, of a father who had disappeared and a mother who had worked 3 jobs until her heart gave out. These were half-truths, carefully polished to mirror Arthur's own history. She didn't tell him that she had spent her teenage years learning how to read people's weaknesses, or that she viewed empathy as a currency to be traded. He fell in love not with Sienna, but with the idea that he could save someone the way his mother had saved him. He wanted to be the wool blanket. He didn't realize he was wrapping himself around a cold, sharp blade. Now come the wedding. The wedding was the first time the Sterling gears truly began to grind against one another. It was held at a restored manor in the Cotswolds, not far from the family workshop. Margaret had insisted on a small, quiet affair. A Sterling wedding should sound like a watch, Arthur, she had told him. Intimate, precise, and built to last. But Sienna had already begun to exert her gravity. She convinced Arthur that a grand announcement was necessary for his career and for the prestige of the Sterling collection. She invited the very people who had once looked down on her. The gallery owners, the critics, the old money of London. On the morning of the wedding, Margaret sat in the dressing room with Sienna. The contrast was stark. Margaret wore a simple silk dress, her scarred hands hidden by lace gloves. Sienna was a vision in white lace and diamonds, diamonds that Arthur had gone into debt to buy. "You look beautiful, Sienna," Margaret said softly. "But remember, a Sterling house is built on the workshop, not the parlor. If you love my son for what he can give you, you will find the house very cold. But if you love him for the time he gives you, you will be the richest woman on earth." Sienna had turned to the mirror, adjusting her veil. She didn't look at Margaret. "Time is a luxury, Margaret. I've spent my whole life waiting for things. I'm done waiting. Arthur is a good man, but he's a dreamer. He needs someone with the grit to turn these dusty clocks into a real empire." Margaret felt the first true chill of the marriage then. She saw that Sienna didn't want to join the family, she wanted to harvest it. The ceremony was a masterpiece of performance. Sienna wept at the altar, a display of overwhelming gratitude that the guests found charming. They saw a rags to riches story. They saw a beautiful woman being rescued by a noble doctor. Only Alistair Finch, standing in the back of the chapel, noticed that Sienna spent more time looking at the 18th century clock on the chapel wall, valuing its casing, than she did looking at her new husband. During the reception, as the champagne flowed, Sienna whispered into Arthur's ear, "We're never going back to the basement, Arthur. From now on, we only look up." Arthur smiled, kissing her hand. He thought she was talking about their shared future. He didn't realize she was talking about the climb toward the gold leaf collection, and that he was merely the ladder she intended to kick away once she reached the top. When Arthur first brought Sienna to the Cotswolds 1 year later, he saw a queen. She was a powerhouse in the London art scene, a woman of silk and sharp angles who promised to bring the Sterling clocks to the global stage. But Margaret, with the eyes of a master clockmaker, saw a faulty mechanism. She watched Sienna walk through the workshop. A true lover of horology touches a clock with the pads of their fingers, feeling for the subtle vibration of the escapement, the pulse of the machine. Sienna touched them like a trader counting coins. She looked at the gold leaf not as art, but as weight. When Arthur left the room to brew tea, the mask of the loving partner slipped. Sienna didn't ask Margaret about her memories, she didn't ask about Henry's legacy. Does the estate own the building outright, Margaret? Or is there a lingering mortgage? Sienna's voice was as sharp as a glass shard. And the Zurich gold collection. I assume the provenance papers are kept in a fireproof vault. It would be a shame if the inheritance taxes ate up the value before Arthur and I could optimize the assets. Margaret sipped her tea, her mind already assembling a new kind of clock, one designed to trap a predator. The value isn't in the gold, Sienna. It's in the time it took to apply it. You can't optimize a life's work. Time is money, darling, Sienna smirked, checking her diamond-encrusted watch. And money is much easier to manage than legacy. That night, Margaret called Alistair Finch. She knew a storm was coming. She just didn't know when the clock would strike. The Master Collection was the crown jewel of the European art world. These weren't just clocks, they were 18th-century automata. To the uninitiated, they were toys. To the Sterlings, they were the literal pieces of a father's life. The centerpiece was the Zurich gold clock. It stood 18 inches high, a tower of solid brass gilded in 24-karat gold leaf. This wasn't mere paint. Gold leaf is gold beaten so thin it becomes a vapor, applied with a brush made of squirrel hair. One sneeze, one heavy breath, and the gold vanishes into the air. Henry Sterling had lost the sight in his left eye because of the microscopic work on the Zurich clock. He had spent 3 years building the golden nightingale that lived inside the clock's dome. Every hour, the bird would emerge, its wings, made of individual gold feathers, would flap, and its throat would vibrate to produce a song that was indistinguishable from a living bird. To Sienna, this was just £2 million in gold and antique markup. To the world, the collection was worth £25 million. Sienna was drowning. Behind her champagne galas, she had secret debts. She had borrowed from the Morettus, men who dealt in high-interest debt and low-mercy enforcement. She had used the Sterling name as collateral for loans she could never repay. She needed the gold to vanish into cash so she could put Margaret in a cheap nursing home, pay off the sharks, and leave Arthur with nothing but a hollow name and a grieving heart. To understand the tragedy that follows, you must understand the Midnight Trust. Margaret knew that Arthur was blinded by love, and love makes for poor navigation. She created a safety switch. In legal circles, it is known as a conditional revocable living trust. In the shadows of the ultra-wealthy, it is known as the Midnight Trust because it can be revoked at the stroke of midnight without a judge, without a jury, and without a public hearing. So Margaret did a trust for Sienna and Arthur, hoping the trust could build their lives in the near future, but Sienna have other plans. Margaret placed a specific poison pill in the trust, the filial care clause. It stated that the heirs were granted management of the estate only so long as they maintained unfailing moral stewardship of the trustor. If, during a medical crisis, a trustee showed gross negligence or a preference for material gain over the physical well-being of the mother, the ownership of the entire Sterling estate, the house, the workshop, the £25 million collection, would revert to the mother instantly. The person who was a millionaire at 7:41 a.m. can legally become a stranger by 7:42 a.m. She willed the gold leaf collection to Sienna in name, giving her the prestige and the management of the gallery. She gave Sienna a taste of the sun, knowing that a vulture cannot help but fly toward the light. After receiving this gift from Margaret as a loving mother-in-law will do for daughter-in-law, Sienna has other plans. This masterpiece was to be kept by Sienna for the family as a generational wealth, but because she is wicked, she has planned to sell it. The morning of the auction, London was draped in a mist that tasted of iron and exhaust. Fast forward, 2 years later, Sienna had not informed anyone of selling the Master Collection. Unfortunately for her, Arthur had heard her conversation with the organizers of the auction. One quiet morning, at 7:30 a.m., Margaret's heart began to falter. The nurse, a woman named Elena, called Arthur. "Dr. Sterling, her rhythm is failing. She's calling for you. You need to come now." Arthur bolted for the door, but his car sat dead in the driveway. The battery had been drained by a dome light Sienna had accidentally left on the night before. He rushed back inside, his face pale with terror. "Sienna! My car is dead. I need your keys. Mom is in cardiac distress. We have to go to the hospital now." Sienna was standing in front of the hallway mirror, applying a layer of power red lipstick. She wore a Chanel suit that cost more than a year of Henry's wages. She didn't even turn around. Arthur, don't be tedious. I have the Morettus and the von Stein time. I'm just She walked out, the click of her heels sounding like a hammer hitting a nail into a coffin. The heavy oak door slammed shut at exactly 7:42 a.m. Arthur has to hail a ride to the mother's sick bed. While Sienna was at the gallery, sipping vintage Krug and mocking the old lady's drama to the von Steins, Arthur sat in a hospital room that smelled of floor wax and impending death. He sat by his mother's bed and looked at her hands. He thought about the lie. He thought about the winter of '95. He looked at his wedding ring and felt a surge of nausea so violent he had to grip the railing of the bed. He realized that for 11 years, he had been sleeping next to a predator. He had been so desperate for love that he had ignored the sound of the gears grinding. He pulled out his phone. His hand was steady, the hand of a surgeon, the hand of a Sterling. He called Alistair Finch. She left me, Alistair. She told me to sort it out while my mother's heart was stopping. She chose the gold. Then the mechanism has triggered, Finch replied, his voice coming through the phone like the tolling of a bell. At 7:42 a.m., when she turned her back on the woman who built her life, she legally became a stranger to this family. The Midnight Trust is active. The hunt is over. The gallery was a cathedral of greed. The billionaires in the front row, men who bought history to hide their own lack of it, watched as the Zurich gold clock was wheeled onto the stage. Sienna stood on the podium, the gavel raised. We open the bidding at £5 million. This is more than a clock, it is the soul of the Sterling name. The back doors of the gallery flew open. Arthur walked in. He wasn't wearing a suit. He was wearing his hospital scrubs, stained with coffee and the sweat of a man who had just watched his mother fight for her life. The auction is over. Sienna laughed, a high, brittle sound that echoed off the marble walls. Arthur, stop this. You're making a scene. You're exhausted. Security, please escort my husband out. No, Sienna, Alistair Finch stepped forward from the shadows, holding a black leather folder. I am the executor of the Sterling Midnight Trust. This building, these clocks, and the very dress you are wearing are assets of the trust. By violating the moral obligation clause at 7:42 a.m., you were stripped of your status as a trustee. You are currently attempting to sell assets that do not belong to you. In this country, that is called grand fraud. The room went cold. The von Steins stood up, their faces turning to masks of disgust. The police are in the lobby, Arthur said, stepping onto the stage and taking the gavel from her numb hand. They aren't here for the clocks, Sienna. They're here for the bank records. They're looking for the deposits you've already stolen from the estate to pay your debts to the Morettus. You wanted to sort it out, Sienna? Well, the gears have finally aligned. It's sorted. Security took the keys. Sienna shrieked, a sound of a woman who had realized she had traded her soul for a gold-plated bird that would never sing for her again. As they led her toward the doors, Arthur leaned in. His voice was a whisper, but in the silence of the gallery, it sounded like thunder. My mother didn't write a will, Sienna. She wrote a test. She knew exactly who you were 11 years ago in that garden. She just gave you enough time to prove it. He dropped a cheap, 5-pound plastic digital watch into her palm. You're obsessed with time. So start counting. You have 5 minutes to leave this property before you're arrested for trespassing. After that, you can count the seconds in a cell. Sort yourself out. Inside the hospital, Margaret opens her eyes. The monitors are steady. She hears a single, perfect tick from the vintage watch on her nightstand. The Sterling clock is finally back on time. Sienna was taken away by the police and further charged with fraud. She spent 12 years in prison because she couldn't pay all the money she owed. In your opinion, do you think 12 years in prison will deter Sienna for putting up such character after prison? Will she change her lifestyle? Leave your comments in the comments section below.